Good evening and welcome to the 2009 Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden Summer Camp Film Festival. My name is Dave Wilt and I'll be your host for this year's series, which features 3 movies starring Japan's most popular movie star, Godzilla. In case you didn't notice on your way in, the Hirshhorn is full of art, and perhaps we can call this year's films in the summer camp cinematic art. Or maybe not, but they will be a lot of fun. Many thanks should go to the Hirshhorn administration, and in particular Kelly Gordon, who masterminds the summer camps. If I'm your camp counselor, Kelly is the activities director. There are several different aspects of this year's films which are worth mentioning. Giant monsters in the movies date back to the silent era. Perhaps the most famous early monster movie was The Lost World, based on a novel by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes. Most of the novel and movie take place on an isolated plateau in the Amazonian jungle, where prehistoric beasts have survived to the present day. But the conclusion is set in London, where a dinosaur escapes and wreaks havoc in the city. The end of this film is remarkably similar in concept to the first great giant monster movie, King Kong, released in 1933. Not surprising, since stop-motion animator Willis O'Brien worked on both films. O'Brien was the preeminent stop-motion animator from the 1920s through the 1940s, although this is not saying much since the animation process was quite labor-intensive and only a handful of giant monster movies were made during these decades. However, in the late 1940s, science fiction films became popular, and a fair number of these included giant monsters of one sort or another. Unknown Island, The Lost Continent, and most notably 1953's The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms were early examples of this genre. Beast is important for several reasons. First, it brought Ray Harryhausen to prominence as a stop-motion animator. Harryhausen was the focus of last year's Summer Camp Film Festival, and he would become the auteur of numerous movies with large doses of stop-motion monster animation over the next 30 years. Beast was also a big box office hit and probably inspired Japanese film executives when they were creating the idea for Godzilla the following year. More giant monster movies followed in Hollywood. We had giant octopi, grasshoppers, scorpions, ants, aliens, mythological monsters, dinosaurs of all shapes and species, birds, etc. The genre became less popular in the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s, at least in Hollywood, but rebounded in the 1990s and 2000s with Jurassic Park, Cloverfield, and so on. Stop-motion animation has largely been replaced by computer-generated images, but that's a story for a future week of summer camp. In addition to the influence and popularity of Hollywood's giant monster science fiction films, another point of interest, to me anyway, is the Japanese film industry's rise to international prominence in the post-World War II era. Japan had a substantial film industry in the silent period, and during the 1930s produced a large number of well-crafted movies which, for various reasons, were not widely seen outside of Japan. Japan's militarist government strongly influenced film content during the Second World War, and afterwards the Allied occupation attempted to purge films of such tendencies. The Japanese film industry rebounded rather quickly. Director Akira Kurosawa led the way, and his 1950 film Rashomon won a Special Academy Award and brought worldwide attention to Japanese cinema. Curiously enough, Japanese film's international profile, beginning with the success of Godzilla in the mid-1950s, was split. On the one hand, there were serious art films, such as those directed by Kurosawa, while on the other side there were giant monster movies, mostly starring Godzilla. Each found a dedicated audience, and each helped make Japanese movies popular overseas. The original Godzilla film was made in 1954. As we mentioned before, this was pretty obviously conceived in the wake of successful Hollywood giant monster movies of the late 40s and early 50s, like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Gojira, as the movie was called in Japan, was a traditional black and white giant monster movie, or Daikaiju in Japan. Nuclear testing revives a dormant dinosaur on a tropical island, and it proceeds to wreck Tokyo before being killed by a secret weapon called the Oxygen Destroyer. The name Gojira is a combination of gorira, which means gorilla, and kujira, which means whale. I have done a rough schematic of this. Gorilla plus whale equals Godzilla. However, some have proposed an alternate origin story of Godzilla, and here that is. The name Godzilla is a rough Americanization of the name Gojira and was first used on the U.S. version of the Japanese film released in 1956 as Godzilla King of the Monsters. This film had newly shot scenes featuring actor Raymond Burr inserted into the Japanese original to help explain the plot and to give the movie a recognizable name for the posters. Perhaps the most striking difference between the Godzilla movies and Hollywood's giant monster films is Japan's use of a monster suit rather than stop-motion animation or another means of creating a giant monster. One of these upcoming summer camp nights we'll take a look at the movie's means of making monsters, but suffice it to say the Japanese Godzilla films always use what some people call suitimation, or man in a suitosaurus. Some of the later films do include effects like CGI, but Godzilla is always some poor sweating stuntman in a rubber suit. This year we're showing 3 Godzilla films, and coincidentally they're each from different eras. Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster is from the first series called the Showa films, which ran from 1955 until 1975. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, tonight's feature, is from the second or Heisei series, beginning in 1984 and running until 1995. Godzilla 2000, the third film of this year's summer camp, was another reset. That is, it ignored all of the previous Godzilla films except the 1954 original and is part of the so-called Millennium series. Godzilla was not the only Japanese giant monster, but he was the most popular and durable. Most of the other repeat character giant monsters were Godzilla's opponents, such as tonight's King Ghidorah, but there were some exceptions. Mothra, a giant moth, appeared in a number of films, including some in which she was the star attraction, and giant rocket-powered turtle Gamera had his own series. Gamera, by the way, was a rare example of a Japanese giant monster movie produced by a company other than Toho, which made the Godzilla movies. As I mentioned, 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was from the unofficial second series. These films tried to return Godzilla to a more ferocious form. Considered among the best Godzilla films overall, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah pits Godzilla against one of his regular opponents, Ghidorah, a three-headed dragon. Ghidorah first appeared in 1964, battling Godzilla, Mothra, and Rodan in the movie Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. One of the most impressive and elaborate giant creatures created for Daikaiju movies, Ghidorah required both a man in a suit and puppeteers and optical effects. In later films, the flying dragon was, unlike Godzilla, also occasionally represented on film by computer-generated images. Ghidorah and Godzilla appeared together in 6 movies, and Ghidorah was also in several later Mothra films. As far as tonight's movie is concerned, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is one of a number of Japanese movies dealing with the Second World War in one form or another. Some are standard war films, but others are fantasy or alternate reality pictures. Tonight's movie is one of them, with time travel, attempts to change the course of history, and other such hijinks. I don't think it is too much of a coincidence that Terminator was released in 1984 and Terminator 2 Judgment Day came out in 1991. The same year, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was released. Once you watch the films, you will see there are certain similarities in the plots. We don't want to impart too much socio-historical context to the Godzilla films, although there certainly is some there. The first movie in particular was considered an allegory about the danger of nuclear weapons, and thus, at least indirectly, a criticism of the United States. Some people think Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah has anti-American or at least anti-foreigner attitudes. As you'll see, the movie revolves around a plot to keep Japan from becoming a world economic superpower. We also see atomic testing, World War II, American and Japanese soldiers, a UFO, visitors from the future, an android, a regular old dinosaur known as Godzillasaurus, who just might mutate into something else, Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, a cyborg version of Ghidorah called Mecha Ghidorah. Oh, this movie is just packed with monstery goodness. Don't forget to come back next week and the week after for 2 more nights of giant lizard action.